Welcome back, guys, and today we're actually going to be venturing into British horror films with some of my favorite films being from the Hammer Productions. And I don't know if you're familiar with those, but they're run for Dracula, Frankenstein, their Mummy films. I believe they produce Woman in Black too. And these films had such an impact on me at such a young age. And I kind of want to go into that later on, but today we're talking about specifically 1958's Horror of Dracula, directed by Terence Fisher, starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. This film is a different take on the Bram Stoker novel of Dracula, and it follows Van Helsing as he finds out about Jonathan Harker going to the Dracula castle, and he becomes infected by the vampire himself, and now Van Helsing must protect his fiancée Lucy from the parasite Dracula. The story of Dracula has always been one of my favorites in literature, and in, cinema too. I think you can make a Dracula movie almost every year, and I probably wouldn't get tired of it. If you have a different filmmaker and a different actor every time, I don't see why you can't keep making the Dracula story over and over again, because it's such a good story to me. This and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I just love Gothic stories and Gothic tales. I love Edgar Allan Poe too. Something about Gothic stories just speak to me, and I don't know what that says about me as a person, but probably means I messed up or something. Horror of Dracula wasn't actually the first Hammer horror film that I saw. So when I was younger, probably around like 9, I was watching TV, and then this film came on called Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. And I became immersed and absolutely sucked in, no pun intended, by the atmosphere and by the whole gravitas of what Hammer does with its films. It just has a certain feel to it, and they all follow the same sort of formula, and I just kind of love that, They just feel so cozy to put on. So I saw Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, loved it, and then I watched The Bride of Dracula, and then after that, I believe Dracula Prince of Darkness, and then I saw Horror of Dracula. But today I figured, why not start from the film that started it all? It really catapulted Hammer for a couple decades, honestly. I mean, it was a big moneymaker for them. This and then the Frankenstein series was raking in the dough for sure. And Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, they tended to reuse a lot. They're particularly fan favorites, you could tell. As well as Terence Fisher. His directing is so good. He has such a unique visual flair in his movies, and you could definitely tell when he's directing a movie and when somebody else is directing, because they just don't feel the same. Terence Fisher directed Horror of Dracula. He directed The Curse of Frankenstein. He directed Curse of the Werewolf. He directed basically a lot of the Dracula and Frankenstein movies. He directed, I believe, 29 of Hammer's horror films. So it all started in 1957 when they made The Curse of Frankenstein. And then after the great success, Hammer decided, hey, we need to get more Universal monster movies and recreate them. And so they got the rights to Dracula, and they decided in 1958 they were going to make, originally titled Dracula in the UK. It ended up being called Horror of Dracula overseas, and I believe everywhere else. These two franchises, Dracula and Frankenstein, literally carried the entire Hammer franchise for a couple decades. They knew they keep pumping out different movies with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee as Dracula or as Frankenstein or whatever, they could have a surefire win there. What is different from the Universal monster movies and the Hammer horror films, though, is that the Hammer films have this sort of glamour and kind of sexiness to them. They make aristocracy seem very cool. I don't know, something about it. It just seems more alive. In Hammer horror films, you could tell that they are going for a younger audience. It feels like, as well as I think they're scarier. I mean, when I was younger, I got scared more by these Hammer horror films than by Bela Lugosi as Dracula, because I feel like Christopher Lee has such a presence on screen and looks like such a formidable force physically that I think he would probably kick Bela Lugosi's ass. Christopher Lee is pretty much well known for playing Dracula. It's become one of his most iconic characters he's ever played. And I love the take he has here on Dracula because he is just pure evil. He doesn't say too much, and he just seems so animalistic. And especially in later sequels, he is more of like an animal. He has these bloodshot eyes, and then the fangs and blood dripping down. And it's kind of more in line with what I visualize from the Bram Stoker novel, because I'm a big fan of the novel. I just don't like seeing Dracula portrayed as much as this kind of seductive guy, you know, like Francis Ford Coppola's version. I really like that one, but it feels too like a love story. Like I don't really know why filmmakers are trying to turn Dracula into a love story, because when I read it, that didn't translate to me. Like an aspect of it, but Dracula's a monster, plain and simple, and it's just how he should be played. So I feel like Lee played that the closest to the character that we've seen. Peter Cushing is also one of my favorite British actors, especially at that time. He just has such a presence on screen as well, which is why him and Lee carry the film so well. Cushing does such a great job of bouncing between this really heroic character of Van Helsing to being this absolute monster as Baron Frankenstein. Cushing has such a charisma on screen that you just can't help but like watching anything he's in. And the guy that plays Alfred in the Michael Keaton Batman movies is also in this movie, which is pretty random, but it's cool. One of my favorite things about these Hammer horror films is that they look so produced and stylized. I mean, nothing about these movies just scream realism. They're not. You know, you could tell that they build these sets and they reuse them later on in different movies for different projects, which is really cool. And it's not going for a sense of realism, it's trying to put you in a sense of fantasy, which is what I appreciate the most. The acting is kind of over the top sometimes, which some may say is kind of a negative for these movies, but I just think it makes it even more charming to watch, you know, when they're like, please help me, please take me away from this terrible place. And I have no idea what that was. The overacting is just such a funny, charming aspect about these movies that I can't help but love it. I know it seems like I've kind of been raving about this movie on and on, but my only real negative with this movie is that they all kind of stray away from Bram Stoker's original novel, especially in the sense, like, from the get-go, Jonathan Harker goes to the castle and he immediately knows that Dracula is a vampire, which is not the case in the novel. And also later on, when Dracula is trying to take hold of Lucy and then Mina, the different characters are just tweaked a little bit for the sake of having a shorter runtime, which I understand. Like at the time in the 50s, 60s, they wanted to have shorter films. So this movie, I believe, is like an hour and 22 minutes. I feel like Bram Stoker's novel has so much put in to the book that you can't really just try to shove it in an hour and 22 minutes. You have to make it kind of like this bigger epic. I really wish they would have just stuck to the original source material as close as possible though, because then this probably would have been one of the best versions of Dracula we would have ever seen. I don't think we've really had an on-screen Dracula that's been the most faithful to the original novel, even with the original Bela Lugosi. I think the closest thing we've gotten has been that show on Netflix. If I got the chance, I would love to tackle a Dracula story and make it as faithful to the novel as possible. Besides that, guys, I only have positives to say about this movie. I have such nostalgic memories from watching the Dracula movies, the Frankenstein movies, so go check out The Horror of Dracula. I'm gonna give The Horror of Dracula 4 out of 5 stars. Thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next episode of 31 Days of Horror.